I am outside of the Pennsylvania Convention Center on 12th and maybe 13th and Arch, something like that. And I am going to ride my skateboard and talk about jiu-jitsu like I've been doing. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is, I don't know. I didn't really have a topic in my mind. One thing I was talking about a while ago, I don't think I filmed anything on it, but talking about defensive positioning in jiu-jitsu and some of the pitfalls and some of the upsides to that. And I think I may have deleted that video, so I may as well talk about it again this time. So one of the things about being defensive in jiu-jitsu is, in the beginning, when you first start jiu-jitsu, a lot of people give the advice to new students, to white belts, to focus on defense and then later on worry about being offensive. And that it's more about surviving now and not getting tapped and then building upwards from there. And I don't think I agree with that. I think that it's important as a new student to build the foundation of a well-rounded skill set, and defense is part of that, but I don't think focusing on defense is the end-all be-all answer that people kind of make it cracked up to be. I think, you know what, let me go through Chinatown a little bit. I think part of the problem with overly focusing on defense as a new student is that it makes too much of a fuss about tapping. So for example, when you first start, if people tell you to don't get tapped, you gotta survive, and to be defensive, then I find that there's, not everybody, but there's some people that tend to be a little bit, they tend to run with that too far, and it tends to turn more into being overly defensive, and they tend to make too big a fuss about getting tapped, and they also tend to make too big a fuss about tapping other people. So the tap becomes this sort of important part of grappling in jiu-jitsu. And it is. I mean, tapping is sort of checkmate in jiu-jitsu. But the problem with overly focusing on tapping, whether it's defense or offensive end of it, is that if you're too focused on defense and you make too fuss about getting tapped, too big a fuss about getting tapped, then it makes you overly cautious to try offensive things. And it makes it harder for you to develop a well-rounded skill set. And it makes it also harder for you to explore the full range of submissions, meaning it makes you more scared to try submissions, because if you mess something up, let's say you mess up an armbar from the guard and you get your guard passed and you're on bottom of side control and you get tapped, it makes you hesitate to do that kind of stuff. And then it also makes you make too big a deal out of it if you tap somebody else. So it's like that classic white belt meme of, the white belt who, a purple belt's letting them do stuff to them, and the white belt taps the purple belt, and then the purple belt's like, oh my God, I'm a king. I tapped this purple belt, I'm so good. I must be, I'll be a world champion someday. When really the purple belt was kind of letting you into the game and letting you move around and do stuff and put themselves in a position where it was possible for you to tap them in the first place. So the highs are too high and the lows are too low is what I'm saying. If you overly focus on, if you make too much importance out of the tap and you make too big a fuss about it. If you don't make a fuss about it and you make sure that people understand that tapping is part of the game and that it means that you tried something and you were unsuccessful and that you need to adjust better next time so that it doesn't happen, but it's not the end of the world, then I think it develops a healthier mindset towards tapping. And I think that also encourages the idea of, yes, developing defense as a white belt, but also developing offense, developing a solid, well-rounded game plan. So for example, one of the things I always advocate for my students in the beginning is to pick to get one high percentage technique from every major position. And I've already talked about this in another video. But the idea is that if you pick one technique from every major position, then it gives you the skeleton of a game that you can then build off of, a well-rounded game. It gives you a sense of how to do takedowns. It gives you a sense of how to do top positioning, bottom positioning, guard passing, playing guard, any kind of guard. And it gives you a framework to build off of, both offense and defensively. And it's something that you can work on some aspect of it every single training session, rather than simply focusing on surviving and defending, and then working backwards from there. I think it'll help you build your skills more evenly, instead of having this like really defensive peak and then an offensive valley. I think you'll be able to build your skills more evenly across the whole spectrum of skills. So that's one perspective on being defensive as a beginner in Jiu-Jitsu. I think the other problem with coaching beginners to be overly defensive in the beginning in Jiu-Jitsu, overly defensive is the key point, I think, overly. Offering a healthy sense of defense is productive because it's part of a well-rounded game. But coaching to be overly defensive or overemphasizing defense for beginners is the problem, because then there are, again, certain beginners that will take that to an extreme. Actually, a lot of beginners that'll take that to an extreme and become the kind of grappler that simply clams up. Thank you. That simply clams up and does nothing during a roll. And what happens when you become that kind of grappler is you deny yourself the opportunity to get better at anything aside from just holding your hands together and laying on bottom of side control. And you deny your training partners valuable experience doing other positions. So, for example, let's say you have, I don't know, your average person has maybe like 3 training sessions per week. That's an hour of class, an hour of open mat, 3 times per week, right? And maybe you leave work early to do that, or you take time away from your family to do that. And you either are or are rolling with the overly defensive person. Even if it's during just one 5-minute round twice a week, that's 10 minutes of training time out of, let's say, 180 minutes of open mat time that could have been spent doing other things. And that's just one person being defensive twice a week. Imagine if you have a group of 4 or 5 white belts that you roll with during open mat that are all kind of doing the same thing, clamming up, being really hesitant to do anything, slowing the action down, surviving, but not really moving in any productive direction. That could easily eat up a third of your training time during open mat. And that becomes a real problem, especially for people with limited training time. So my advice is to get after it and try to implement all of your skills. And you will end up in negative positions. And that's your chance to practice, yes, survive, try to defend submissions and don't get tapped. And then immediately try to escape, be proactive with it. Don't stall, don't try to stop the game at 0 and make nothing happen. Try to keep the action moving, try to be proactive. And when you do get tapped, don't make too big a fuss about it, because when you make it too big a fuss about it, on either end, positive or negative, again, it builds an unhealthy and unproductive attitude towards winning and losing. And when I say unhealthy, I'm more focused on productive. I do think a lot about healthy and unhealthy attitudes in training, but I think productive and unproductive attitudes in training is something that I think is maybe more useful to focus on. Because if you look at productive and unproductive habits in training and mentalities in training, then you're working with something that is kind of measurable. Whereas with healthy and unhealthy attitudes towards training, yeah, it's kind of measurable. And you do have a sense of like, okay, well, I feel bad about training and I'm developing negative associations with training that make me not want to train. And that's definitely something that's tangible and it's real. But if you think of productive and unproductive things, attitudes towards training, then what ends up happening is a productive attitude towards training is one that promotes longevity, will keep you consistently training over a long period of time, which means basically having the habits that will make it more and more and more likely for you to be highly skillful in a shorter amount of time in jiu-jitsu than other habits, such as like unproductive habits, which are making too big a fuss about tapping or being tapped, maybe talking trash during training to your general population training partners, having them talking trash to you, being in an environment where you feel stressed out and uncomfortable much of the time. Again, there are people who can do well in these environments, but I think by and large, most people tend to be less productive in those environments than more productive, because the average person, I think, is going to be more reluctant to want to go consistently to jiu-jitsu class when they're training with a bunch of people that they don't want to be around and they feel stressed out, especially if they're taking time away from other enjoyable things in their lives that they could be doing, or work stuff. So anyway, that's just a long way of saying that I think focusing towards productivity is more useful than focusing towards, less tangible things. What is productive? Again, productive are habits that make it more likely that you will want to train consistently over a long period of time. And those tend to be habits that are nourishing and rewarding to your jiu-jitsu experience, but ultimately, like I said before, things that will make it likely that you'll do the things necessary to become more and more skillful and satisfied doing jiu-jitsu. While we're talking about productivity, this gets me, sort of a stream of consciousness thinking, gets me thinking about different types of training and drilling habits and productivity. One thing I was talking to my friend about a while ago is I've had a lot of discussions with friends over the years about whether drilling, like static drilling, is super useful, or positional sparring is more useful, or some sort of hybrid of those things are useful, or if it's better just to roll and try stuff during rolling. And I think one thing to consider in this sort of discussion is that most of us in jiu-jitsu when it comes to skill development, unless we're professional athletes working with a professional coach that really knows what they're doing, we're all working under suboptimal conditions, meaning that from a skill development perspective, most of us are we're making a trade-off between, things that are enjoyable, and time constraints and all these other constraints, and sacrificing from what would be optimal skill development practices. And I think for optimal skill development practices, most of us who do it recreationally, semi-professionally, or even professionally, would really struggle to stick to an actual professional training program that is optimal. And so when we're talking about what's the best benefit, what are the best practices for developing fast skill in jiu-jitsu, you got to factor in that, again, we are usually most of the time working in suboptimal environments. And so the best practices are going to be the ones that are the best you can do. It's like dieting. We live in the real world. It's not possible for all of us to pre-plan all of our meals and calculate every macro and calorie and, test our blood every single day to see where our sugar levels are at or whatever. that would be optimal nutritional practices, I suppose. I'm just guessing. But most of us are in a situation where we can't do that. So we have to work under suboptimal conditions. And that means that we do the best that we can with what we have available. So when it comes to jiu-jitsu, it's similar. Like if you work at a place where the only thing available to you is a hot dog stand outside of your work at lunch, and maybe a hot dog stand, a fruit stand, and like a halal cart, then instead of getting, you might not get like a cheeseburger with fries and onion rings every single day for lunch. You might choose, the hot dog cart might have a grilled chicken sandwich and maybe, pretzels instead of potato chip. You get what I'm saying. You sort of make the best that you have available. It's not perfect, but you do what you can. And it's the same thing in jiu-jitsu. So I think when we're talking about productive and optimal training practices for your own personal situation, what you want to aim towards is getting as much repetition as possible of the closest possible situation to what you're training for. Like if you're training for competition, then you want to try to set up your training practices to mimic as closely as possible situations that you're likely to encounter during a competition, including building up in intensity, certain positions that you come across in competition that you may not come across during normal recreational training, certain styles of grappler that you may not naturally come across during normal open mat training. And I think positional sparring is a great way to get high repetition of those situations and build skill as best you can. And I think giving yourself specific constraints while you're doing that is an important and useful way to make the most out of your positional sparring. So a concrete example. If I am getting ready for an IBJJF tournament and I am in Black Belt Masters 3 category and I'm doing, let's say, no-gi worlds, then I will do a scouting report on my division and I'll see what the people in my division, what are the positions that are usually played. There's a lot of half guard. There's a couple of like good wrestlers that are in my division that do like long distance Toriano style passing. Not too many closed guard players that I recall when I did a scouting report recently. So I'll pick the positions and the situations that I'm most likely to run into. So top of half guard, bottom of half guard, double leg, single leg style takedowns, and bottom of butterfly guard against a strong Toriano passer, and top of fucking asshole, top of open guard against the same sort of situation, against a butterfly guard or a player like that. And then I think the feeling to mimic is a lot of the people in my division are in their 40s, but most of them look pretty strong and pretty jacked. So I think training with people who can simulate that same sort of old, not old, but like older, like dad strength kind of feel. Maybe focusing on less like mobility and dynamic people and more on like tight isometric compression style grapplers. And so if I was designing a training program for myself to get ready for something like that, then I would try to find training partners who can mimic those situations and that feel as closely as possible. And then I would do endless rounds of positional sparring with those people. And if I didn't have the luxury of doing positional sparring with them, then what I would try to do is I would pick my training partners carefully during open mat to try to give myself the chance to play in those situations as often as possible. So I might pick, if I have a very strong blue belt who's in his 40s, who used to wrestle when he was in college and has a decent double leg, then I would train with him from the feet to kind of simulate some of the challenges that I'll come across against somebody in my division with a similar feel to that. And he's not a black belt, but I think that blue belt can simulate, give me a similar feel and look to what I would experience in that specific part of the game. And if I could train with, let's say, another, like a purple belt that I know of who is a really fast, dynamic Toriano passer with a like low head position Toriano passing, then I would train with them because they could simulate that part of the game. And I would either train with them a lot during open mat and try to force those situations, or ask my training partner if they don't mind doing that to me over and over and over again during our rolls. And so in a perfect world, I would have a coach putting together a training plan for me and doing specific drilling and semi-resistance drilling and positional sparring and building up over the course of a 6 or an 8 week training camp to prepare for an event like that. But again, during suboptimal conditions, if I don't have that optimal situation going on, I can make the most out of my training by, again, trying to simulate the demands and the challenges that I'm going to face as closely as possible, and then carefully picking my training partners based on who can challenge me in as close to that skill set as possible. And I think most of us can do something similar to that. I think a worst case scenario, like meaning worst case for skill development, would be something where maybe you're a higher level athlete and the challenges of something that you're preparing for are just simply things that your training partners cannot recreate because maybe they don't have the skill set, maybe they don't have the body type. For example, when I was a brown belt and competing at featherweight in gi tournaments, a lot of the people who were competing in the the Pans, the Worlds, some of the bigger tournaments that I wanted to do were Spider Guard, Lasso Guard, and Berimbolo players. And at the time, I didn't have anybody my size, or any size really, who could play the same way that those guys played at a competitive level. And so the best I could do was try to study those games, learn how they work, and then try to teach my students how to play those games, or try to help my training partners recreate those kind of games for me. And again, it's suboptimal, it's not perfect, but if you're a purple belt or a brown belt, and let's say you have a school somewhere and you're teaching all brand new white belts how to do jiu-jitsu, and you're trying to prepare for an event, or you want to keep your skill set sharp and not atrophy too much, then what you can do is try to study the challenges that you're preparing for and try to help your students, teach them how to recreate those as best they can, and then get positional sparring with them in those specific things. That's one strategy. I think another strategy would be to study your division or study the challenges that you want to prepare for, and then try to find universal points where all human beings behave the same way. So picking positions, oh dang, almost ate shit. Picking positions that pretty much everybody, whether they're an untrained white belt or a world-class black belt, trying to find positions and situations where the white belt behaves in a very similar way to the world-class black belt. And then spend a lot of time trying to find ways to get into those situations, and then training those situations until you're just unstoppable in them. So for example, this is actually an idea that this guy, Trumpet Dan Lucart, who's a very, very intelligent grappling coach in California. He's the owner of Brea Jiu Jitsu. he pointed this out about Roger Gracie a long time ago, maybe when, I don't know, I was a purple belt. I think Dan was a purple belt too. And he made a blog post, I think, on Sherdog forums about it. And he was saying that one of the interesting things about Roger Gracie is that a lot of his game, or at least like key parts of his game, are positions where his white belt training partners behave roughly the same way that world-class black belts in his division behave. And so, for example, if he's on top of half guard and he's got shoulder pressure across the neck and his head is under the armpit on the underhook side, most of the time a white belt is going to feel that shoulder pressure and they're going to start explosively bridging and pushing and turning to try to get out of that situation. And a world-class black belt is likely to do roughly the same thing, maybe with a little bit more finesse, maybe not. But, you know, something like that bridging and pushing and explosively turning may be adding like a butterfly hook, but it's not that different than what the white belt is doing. And so I think Dan speculated, and I may be, you know, this is over 10 years ago, so I may be misparaphrasing, but I think Dan was speculating that part of the reason that Gracie was so successful in, you know, basically mauling everybody in the 2009-2010 Black Belt World Championships of Jiu-Jitsu, despite training mostly with his white and blue belt training partners, was that factor of being able to put himself in situations where they behaved very similarly to his opponents at a black belt level would behave. And I can see it, like if I'm watching footage of Gracie, I can see in a lot of situations, like that half guard, for example, there are going to be similarities in behavior. And even if the behaviors are a little different, I think they're similar enough where he could coach his white and blue belts to give him a sort of realistic look, like the kind of look he would come across at a world-class competition. And that's not to say that, you know, that alone is enough, because, you know, he still has to sharpen up and train with other world-class black belts to get the complete package of physical, technical, tactical, and mental skills sharpened to prepare for a high-level tournament like that. But I think maybe he could get a lot of his work done during an off-season training with white and blue belts in that way. And so, taking that same thought process, you can kind of do the same thing for yourself, I think, where if you're training in an environment where you don't have access to, you know, super high-level training partners, or you don't have people who can recreate specific things that you really need to practice against, then again, what you can do is take a page out of Roger Gracie's notebook and think about, how can I put these people in a position where they're going to behave really similar to the way that my opponents or my old training partners, people that I'm trying to keep sharp against, if they're gonna, how can I get my training partners to behave in a way that's similar to them? Kind of an interesting idea, and sort of got my own thinking juices going right now. I think maybe some ideas for positions like that. I think that's definitely, you know, I think half guard is a pretty easy position to do that in, both top and bottom, especially underhook based half guard. One thing that I noticed is that, in underhook based half guard, which is something that I play a lot, the way that high level competitors deal with it and the way that newer people deal with it, it is significantly different, but it's not so different, I think, that I couldn't coach a blue belt to give me some of the same body positioning and technique. So it's not like something like Varamolo, for example, which really requires a lot of counterintuitive movement, finesse, training, specific body types to make it work at a high level. Underhook half guard, I think, is something that, you know, you can really coach your less experienced training partners to give you a hard time in a very short amount of time and get some really good work out of them. I think another interesting point about underhook half guard is that in a lot of ways, and this is something that I talked about when I did that instructional with Artichoke Media years ago, is that underhook half guard is very similar to a lot of wrestling positions. A failed single leg, somebody sprawls and you're hip to hip on them, or shoulder to hip, very similar to underhook half guard when you get to your knees in a dogfight position. The dogfight position itself occurs pretty naturally in wrestling. And so, again, I think underhook half guard has the virtue of being a position that you can get, like, at least in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of people who wrestled at a reasonable to high level. And so most jiu-jitsu schools have people who have had high school or college wrestling experience, ranging from anywhere from competent to great wrestling experience. And I think what that means is that you can almost always find a way to get good work out of your training partners by playing underhook half guard, especially going up to a dogfight position, because you can usually find wrestlers who can recreate some of the challenges you'll come across and some of the issues with sweeping and stabilizing a sweep and holding the pin after you sweep, taking the back. And for the skills that are very jiu-jitsu centric that they don't know how to do yet, pretty easy to coach. Pretty easy to coach them to do those things. So anyway, at this point, I think I'm kind of just repeating myself over and over again. And then I got people yelling out their window at me as they're driving by, so I'm gonna call it a day for this one. Hope you enjoyed. Talk to you later. Bye.